Gemma, Haddon said calmly, sliding the paper toward me. Mom left you the debt. I stared at the number. 15 million. That's impossible, I whispered. Dahlia sighed, fake tears ready. You signed it. We all watched you. I looked at the signature. My name, my voice, my ruin. Attorney Chikatilo didn't meet my eyes. It's legally binding. That's when I understood. They didn't want my inheritance. They wanted me to disappear. The air in Attorney Chikatilo's office was thick, tasting of stale mahogany polish and the ghost of expensive cigars. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week since my mother, Lacey, vanished into the humid Texas heat. I sat in a high-backed leather chair that felt more like a cage than a seat. Across from me, my brother Haddon adjusted his gold cufflinks with a precision that bordered on surgical. Beside him, Dahlia dabbed at eyes that hadn't seen a real tear in years, her designer silk scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders. I watched their hands. Haddon's were manicured, restlessly tapping the table. Dahlia's were adorned with rings that caught the afternoon sun. My own hands remained still, unadorned, resting on my lap like two quiet witnesses. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a funeral or a betrayal. Looking at the empty chair where my mother should have been, the grief felt like a lead weight in my chest. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who share your blood and felt completely like a stranger? Attorney Chikatilo cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that broke the tension. He laid a thick, black file on the desk between us. It didn't look like legal paperwork. It looked like a casket. He didn't look at me. He looked at Haddon. I remembered my grandfather once saying that a tree is known by its fruit, and a family by how they treat the one who has nothing to offer them. In that moment, I knew I was the one they intended to harvest. I took a slow breath, keeping my spine straight. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Gemma, Haddon started, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, oily sympathy. We've had to make some difficult discoveries this week. Mom, she wasn't as organized as we thought. He gestured toward the file, his eyes remaining cold despite the softness of his tone. He slid a single document across the polished wood. It was a debt assumption agreement, notarized and stamped with the state seal of Texas. My name was at the top, printed in bold, unforgiving black ink. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the figures. $15 million. The numbers blurred for a second before my forensic mind snapped them back into focus. It was an ironclad debt, linked to various energy investments and offshore liabilities. Haddon claimed Mother had entrusted me with these obligations to prove my maturity. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor by letting me take the fall. They say blood is thicker than water, but in this office, it felt as thin as a counterfeit check. A sharp, familiar curiosity began to cut through the shock. As an auditor, I knew how to read between the lines, and these lines felt wrong. My mother loved us, but she wasn't a fool, and she certainly wouldn't have buried her youngest daughter under a mountain of debt while leaving her eldest son the crown jewels of the family business. I realized then that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting a lie as truth. It means refusing to let their darkness dictate my light. I wasn't going to cry, I was going to calculate. I leaned forward, my nose catching a faint, sharp chemical scent clinging to the paper. It wasn't the smell of an old file. It was the specific, ozone-heavy scent of a high-end laser toner, the kind used exclusively in Haddon's private executive suite at the energy firm. I looked at the signature. Gemma Bennett. It looked like mine. It felt like mine. But the ink was too fresh, the pressure too uniform. I was staring at a masterpiece of fraud, and my own brother was the artist. Dahlia leaned back, a sinister smile playing on her lips. To be fair, Gemma, you've always been her spoiled darling. It's time you took on the responsibility of managing the Bennett family fortune. I looked at her, seeing the emptiness hidden beneath the expensive makeup. I'd always believed that wealth is about giving, not receiving. They looked like the poorest people I'd ever known. They had money, but they'd lost their souls along the way. I stood up slowly, the leather of the chair creaking in the silent room. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I reached out and took the only thing in the room that actually belonged to my heart. the small painting titled Autumn Twilight. It was a forest scene Mother had cherished, one Haddon and Dahlia considered worthless junk. "I'll take this," I said quietly. Haddon reached into his pocket and slid a check for $1,000 toward me. "For your immediate expenses," he said, the condescension thick in the air. I left the check on the table, a pittance offered to a woman they had just robbed of $15 million. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The Houston heat hit me like a wall as I stepped onto the sidewalk. I reached my car and pulled the door open, my heart hammering against my ribs. Just as I sat down, my phone buzzed in my bag. It was a notification from my bank. My accounts were frozen. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. In the rearview mirror, I saw a black SUV pull out from a parking spot a block away, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh Texas sun. It followed me as I pulled into traffic. They thought they had trapped me. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of paper and debt. I shifted the car into gear, my mind already stripping away the first layer of their lie. They forgot one thing. You should never try to bury someone who knows how to dig for the truth. The drive home from the law office felt like navigating through a thick, invisible fog. Houston's skyline, usually a beacon of progress, looked like a jagged row of teeth waiting to swallow me whole. My knuckles remained white against the steering wheel as I replayed Haddon's oily voice in my mind. He didn't just want my inheritance, he wanted my ruin. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar brick of my suburban home offering a temporary, fragile sense of sanctuary. I sat in the dark for a moment, the silence of the car cabin echoing the hollowness in my chest. I reached for my phone, needing to hear a friendly voice, someone who knew the Gemma that wasn't a debtor. I dialed Sarah, my closest friend since college. It rang 3 times before clicking over to a robotic voicemail. I tried Mark, my mentor, busy signal. I tried the office, my access code had already been revoked. The screen flickered with a notification that made my stomach drop. A viral post from Dahlia. It was a carefully edited montage. Photos of me at a charity gala looking exhausted, interspersed with forged bank statements suggesting a gambling addiction. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. "We pray for our sister Gemma. Addiction is a silent thief that stole our mother's peace before stealing her presence." I stared at the blue light reflected in my tired eyes. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who knows your favorite color and how you drink your coffee? My close circle of friends was slowly turning into a social desert in real time. "True friends are like stars," I whispered to the empty car. "You only see them when it's dark. It seems my sky is pitch black right now." The speed at which I was disappearing was astonishing. Despite the panic clawing at my throat, I remembered I had a duty. I called my daughter's teacher and left a gentle, steady voicemail. I told her I'd be away on a brief business trip and confirmed the emergency contact list. I refused to let my family's toxicity pollute her world. Shielding her was my only priority. A small act of kindness in a world that had suddenly become very cold. That was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a ghost. I stepped inside my house, but the air felt thin. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the kitchen, watching the street through the slats of the blinds. Within 10 minutes, a set of headlights swept across my living room walls. A dark SUV, similar to the one that followed me from the office, idled at the curb. 2 men, shadowy figures in the Texas twilight, stepped out. They didn't ring the bell. They pounded. "Gemma, we know you're in there!" The shout muffled through the heavy oak door. $15 million doesn't just go away. Open up. The pounding was rhythmic. A violent heartbeat against my sanctuary. My breathing hitched, but I didn't move. I retreated to the hallway, away from the windows, my forensic mind already cataloging the threat. I pulled out my phone and hit record, capturing the audio of their harassment. A vibration in my hand startled me. "Haddon," I answered, my voice a flat, emotionless line. "Your timing is impeccable, Haddon." He sighed, that rehearsed sound of a weary savior. "Gemma, I heard things are getting aggressive. Those collectors, they don't play by the rules. I can make this all go away. Just sign the deed to Lacey's estate over to the company trust. I'll absorb the debt. You can have your life back." I looked at the door as a heavy boot kicked the frame. I knew the law. Under the Texas Debt Collection Act, these men were committing multiple felonies. But I also knew who held their leashes. Haddon wasn't offering a life raft. He was offering a different kind of cage. A lion does not flinch at the laughter of hyenas, I thought. I didn't plead. I didn't scream. I simply hung up the phone. I realized then that my home was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. I moved through the house with practiced, quiet efficiency. I grabbed my tactical bag, the one I kept for long-distance audits. Laptop, forensic hardware, my mother's old ledger, and the painting Autumn Twilight. I felt a strange, cold freedom as I packed. Every item I left behind was a tether I was cutting. I slipped out through the side garage door, staying low in the shadows of the hedges. As I reached the back alley, I saw a tow truck backing into my driveway to seize my car. They were moving fast, trying to paralyze me before I could find my footing. I walked 3 blocks to a convenience store and tossed my GPS-tracked phone into a passing trash truck. I was officially off the grid. The humanitarian beat of my heart led me to one final stop. I slipped onto my elderly neighbor's porch and tucked a note and my spare key under his mat. He had been like a father to me after Dad died. I thanked him for years of kindness and asked him to look after the rose bushes. I refused to let my siblings' cruelty turn me into a person who forgets gratitude. Character isn't built in the light, it's revealed in the darkness. I hailed a taxi using cash and asked for a nondescript motel near the interstate. The Palms Inn was a place of flickering neon and the smell of cheap disinfectant, perfect for a woman who didn't exist anymore. I checked in under a pseudonym, the clerk not even looking up from his tabloid. I bolted the door and sat on the edge of the saggy mattress, the silence finally catching up to me. I reached for the painting, my fingers trembling slightly as I traced the frame. There was a slight irregularity in the backing paper, a seam that didn't match the original restoration work. I used a small pocket knife to peel back the heavy brown paper. Taped to the center of the canvas was a single micro SD card. It was small, unassuming, but it felt heavier than the $15 million debt I was carrying. I sat there for a long time, watching the neon light from the window pulse red and blue against the wall. My mother hadn't left me a debt. She hadn't left me a burden. She had left me a map to the gallows of my siblings. The air in the Palms Inn motel room was stale, a mixture of cheap disinfectant and the metallic tang of old radiator heat. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread, the blue glow from my laptop screen carving sharp angles into the darkness. Outside, Houston's highway hummed with the indifferent energy of millions, but inside this 4-walled sanctuary, the world was reduced to binary code. I held the micro SD card between my thumb and forefinger. It was a sliver of plastic no larger than a fingernail, yet it felt like the heaviest thing I had ever carried. The slot on my laptop accepted the card with a soft click. The file explorer blossomed with a chaotic array of encrypted folders and fragmented system logs. It was a digital ghost hunt. As a forensic auditor, I had spent half my life chasing shadows through bank ledgers. But this was different. This wasn't just a client's portfolio. This was my mother's final breath captured in data. Every file was locked behind a triple-layer encryption protocol. I tried birthdays, house numbers, and bank pins, but the system remained stubbornly silent. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and searched for the one thing my siblings would never bother to remember. I typed in the date of the first restoration project Lacey and I ever completed together, a battered 19th century landscape. The screen flickered, the lock icon vanished, and the folders unfurled like a blooming flower. Lies are like shadows. They seem large and terrifying until you find the source of the light. My family forgot that I was trained to find the light in the numbers. They saw me as the quiet one, the sister who could be pushed into the corner and ignored. They didn't understand that while they were busy shouting, I was busy observing. I found a hidden video file at the bottom of the directory. I hit play. Lacey appeared on the screen. She looked tired, her eyes darting towards something off camera. Her voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the hum of a ventilation system. She spoke of being coerced, of papers pushed in front of her while she was disoriented, of Haddon's new associates who never left her side. My heart twisted with a visceral, protective fury. Despite the betrayal I had felt at the law office, I found myself whispering a prayer for her safety. She hadn't left me a debt. She had been forced to sign a trap, and she had spent her final moments of freedom making sure I had the tools to dismantle it. I navigated deeper into the system logs, and that's when I saw the anomaly. I found a series of audio files labeled voice_sync_final. I opened one. It was my voice. Or rather, it was a terrifyingly perfect imitation of it. I watched the waveforms dance across the screen. On the left, a recording of my actual voice from a public keynote I gave last year. On the right, the synthetic clone used in a series of recorded calls to predatory lenders in East Texas. The clone Gemma had authorized the $15 million in high-interest liabilities with a cold, robotic precision. Hearing myself betray my own future was a psychological violation that made my skin crawl. It was a visceral sense of identity theft. My own sister, Dahlia, had used her boutique marketing firm's AI resources to manufacture my consent. She hadn't just stolen my money, she had tried to steal my soul. I stared at the metadata of the voice files. The originating IP address was a direct hit. It was registered to Dahlia's private suite in the Heights. Under the Texas Business and Commerce Code, this wasn't just a family dispute. This was first-degree fraudulent identity theft, a felony. It was the silver bullet that would negate the validity of every document Haddon had shoved across that mahogany table. But a mask can never replicate the heart of the person it imitates. They had the voice, but they lacked the spirit. The night wore on, the neon light from the motel sign pulsing red against the peeling wallpaper. I began a forensic counterstrike, cross-referencing the synthetic signatures with the auto pen patterns I had noted on the original documents. Haddon's vanity was his downfall. He used the same rhythmic pressure for every forgery, a mechanical tell that no human hand could ever produce. I compiled the evidence into a secure, off-site cloud server. I knew I couldn't go to the Houston PD yet. Haddon's influence reached into the city's highest offices, and Attorney Chikatilo had enough friends in the local judiciary to bury me before a judge ever saw a file. I needed the big guns. I needed the SEC and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. As I scrubbed through Haddon's leaked emails, I found a list of other small creditors he had crushed: local contractors, elderly investors, people who didn't have the forensic tools to fight back. I resolved then that this wasn't just about Gemma Bennett. It was about restoring the dignity of everyone they had stepped on to build their empire of sand. Every person who had been told their signature was their ruin deserved the truth. Dawn began to bleed through the cheap motel curtains, a thin gray light that offered no warmth. I ran one final diagnostic on the SD card's hidden background processes. A small, blinking red dot appeared on the integrated map. It was a GPS ping, encrypted and buried under 3 layers of system noise. It was moving. The signal was traveling toward a remote industrial sector in East Texas, miles away from the manicured lawns of the Bennett estate. It was labeled with a simple, chilling tag: Lacey_device_active. My breath hitched. She was alive. They hadn't just hidden her, they were moving her. The gray light was unforgiving, much like my resolve. I closed the laptop and felt the cold, hard weight of the painting against my legs. I had the evidence, the motive, and now I had a location. I checked the reflection in the motel's cracked mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the quiet sister anymore. She was a forensic hunter who had finally found the scent of the prey. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. I knew that by saving Lassie, I would be walking straight into the trap they had spent months perfecting. But Haddon and Dahlia had made a fatal error in their calculations. They thought they were the only ones playing the game. They didn't realize that I had already rewritten the rules. The rain in Houston doesn't just fall. It drowns the air in a thick, suffocating humidity that sticks to your skin like a guilty conscience. I stood in the corner of a quiet, dusty archive room in the Heights library, the smell of old paper acting as a temporary shield against the chaos outside. My hands were steady, but the weathered envelope Vera pushed toward me felt as heavy as a lead weight. Looking at her, I saw a map of a life well lived in the wrinkles of her face, but today, those lines were etched with a terror I had never seen before. Vera's fingers trembled as they brushed against mine. She had been my mother's silent partner in small acts of rebellion for 40 years. The only person who knew where the real bank transfers were buried. Gemma, I found them, she whispered, her voice barely a thread. The original trails, before your brother's lawyers got to the digital logs. She slid the envelope across the table, her eyes darting toward the library entrance. Haddon's men had already visited her. They hadn't used fists. They had used her son's career, threatening to revoke his medical license over a manufactured ethics violation, if she spoke to me. I held her hands in mine, feeling the brittle warmth of her skin. It was a moment of genuine human connection that felt dangerously out of place in this new world of deepfakes and digital assassinations. Kindness is never a mistake, Vera, I told her, my voice low and resolute. Even if they use it as a weapon against us, the fact that you chose to help is a victory they can never understand. I realized then that Haddon wasn't just coming for my money. He was trying to poison the very idea of loyalty. I saw the black SUV idling at the rainy street corner through the library's tall windows. A silent, metallic threat. I knew I had to move. I took the documents, tucked them into my coat, and gave Vera a final lingering squeeze of the hand. I had to distance myself from her immediately. If I stayed, I was a target. If I left, I became a distraction. It was a heart-wrenching sacrifice, leaving the only person who believed in me alone in that dusty room. But it was the only way to keep her son safe. As I stepped onto the rainy sidewalk, my phone erupted with a barrage of notifications. I had connected to the library's public Wi-Fi for only a second, but it was enough for the digital wolves to find me. I ducked into a nearby phone booth, the glass cold against my forehead. On the screen, Dahlia was live. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a viral livestream titled The Truth About Our Mother. She was weeping, her designer makeup perfectly smudged to suggest hours of genuine grief. She held up what looked like bank receipts, claiming I had sold Lacey to an offshore care facility in Mexico to avoid paying for her real medical bills. The comments section was a slaughterhouse. Monster, one read. How could she do that to her own mother? Another flashed by. It was a public execution in the town square of the internet. I felt the sting of those manufactured tears through the screen, a suffocating weight of digital lynching that threatened to crush my spirit. They were painting a monster to hide their own faces, but a reflection in a broken mirror is still just a lie. I didn't mourn my reputation. There was no time for vanity. Instead, I stared at the screen with the cold, detached eye of a forensic auditor. I understood the legal play here. Dahlia wasn't just seeking attention. Under the federal rules of evidence, specifically Rule 608, this was a calculated attempt at character assassination to ensure that if I ever made it to a courtroom, no jury would believe a word I said. My credibility was being dismantled by a woman who wouldn't know the truth if it bit her. The rain began to blur the neon signs of the neighboring shops, the red and blue lights bleeding together on the wet pavement. I stood in that booth, my reflection split by a crack in the glass, symbolizing the dual life I was now forced to lead. I felt a sharp, icy pivot in my gut. The shock was gone. The hurt was buried. I began to analyze Dahlia's performance, not as a sister, but as a technician looking for a bug in the code. I zoomed in on the background of her video. There was a slight, nearly imperceptible lag in the way the light hit her hair compared to the shadows on the wall behind her. It was a green screen. She wasn't at a charity vigil at the park like she claimed. She was in the climate-controlled boardroom of Haddon's Energy headquarters. Her vanity was her undoing. She wanted the perfect lighting of a studio while pretending to be in the trenches of grief. Power is like a skyscraper. The higher it goes, the more a single crack in the foundation matters. Dahlia's ego was that crack. She couldn't resist the urge to look beautiful while she lied. I pulled out my laptop, tethering it to a burner signal I had secured. I didn't send a public rebuttal. I didn't beg for mercy. I simply sent a coded, anonymous message to a prominent investigative journalist who had been Dahlia's biggest social media rival for years. I attached the metadata from the live stream, the hidden GPS tags that proved she was at Haddon's office, and a side-by-side comparison of the lag. It was just enough to start a fire. If they wanted to play the game of public perception, I would give them a lesson in how quickly the wind can change. I watched the first few comments on the rival's page begin to question the vigil. The digital flames were beginning to spread. I stepped out of the phone booth and let the rain wash over me. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I was no longer the one being hunted. While they were busy managing their image and scrambling to fix the narrative, I would be moving toward the one place they thought I'd never find. My mother had taught me that a secret is only a secret as long as people are looking for the obvious. I headed toward the old family cellar, the original bank transfers tucked against my heart, ready to tear their trap wide open. The heavy rain outside the old family estate in the outskirts of Houston sounded like thousands of tiny hammers trying to break through the roof. I stood in the humid darkness of the hidden cellar, the beam of my flashlight cutting through decades of dust and thick cobwebs. Every step I took on the damp concrete floor echoed with the weight of a truth I was almost afraid to find. I wasn't just Gemma, the forensic auditor, tonight. I was a daughter hunting for the heartbeat of a mystery that had swallowed my life whole. I followed the light until it rested on a rusted filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten moving blankets. It was labeled with a cryptic, handwritten 404. A code I knew my mother, Lacey, used to signify things she wanted to keep hidden from view. My hands shook as I pried the drawer open. Inside, tucked between yellowed insurance policies, was a small leather-bound diary and several amber medical vials. I opened the diary. The handwriting was shaky, a stark contrast to the elegant script I remembered from my childhood. As I read, the air in the cellar seemed to turn to ice. My mother had documented everything. She described how Haddon and Dahlia had begun bringing her special herbal teas to help her sleep. She wrote about the fog that settled over her brain, the way her hands felt like lead when they pressed a pen into her fingers to sign the debt transfers. "They think I don't know," one entry read, "but the bitter taste in the tea is the same as the look in Haddon's eyes." I picked up one of the vials. It was a potent sedative, a drug that, when used in high doses on the elderly, causes profound disorientation and compliance. "Evil doesn't always arrive with a roar," I whispered to the empty, shadowed room. "Sometimes it comes as a cup of tea from your own children." A surge of protective love, sharper than any anger, flared in my chest. I tucked the diary and the vials into my bag, vowing that I would cleanse Lacey's name if it was the last thing I ever did. But even in the deepest cellar, the truth has a way of breathing, and right now, it was gasping for air. Suddenly, the darkness outside the cellar windows was shattered by a strobe of red and blue. The high-pitched wail of sirens drowned out the drumming rain. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hadn't even reached the stairs before the cellar door was kicked open. Haddon stepped into the light, his expensive suit pristine despite the storm. Beside him was Attorney Chikatilo, a thin, predatory smile stretched across his face. "Gemma, Gemma," Haddon sighed, his voice full of a manufactured, tragic disappointment. "We tried to help you, but breaking into family property to hide your evidence, that's a new low." Chikatilo stepped forward, gesturing to a pair of Houston police officers behind them. He didn't look at the cabinet I had opened. Instead, he pointed directly at my open laptop on the work table. "Officer, if you'll check the browser history," Chikatilo said smoothly. The officer leaned over, clicking through my recent files. A digital pharmacy receipt blossomed on the screen, a purchase for the exact sedative found in the vials, made 3 days ago using my personal credit card. I stared at it, the blood draining from my face. I hadn't made that purchase. But as a forensic expert, I knew exactly what was happening. They had used the deepfake credentials Dahlia created to bypass my banking security. Under U.S. federal law, constructive possession is a powerful tether. I was in a room full of illegal substances with a digital paper trail linking me to the purchase. The handcuffs felt cold and heavy as they snapped around my wrists. The suffocating realization hit me. They had turned my own meticulous nature into my cage. Haddon looked at me, and for a split second the mask of the grieving brother slipped, revealing the cold, reptilian satisfaction underneath. The ride to the station was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the silence of the officers. I was processed in a daze, the scent of industrial cleaner and old coffee filling the air. Eventually, I was led into a sterile interrogation room. The fluorescent lights hummed with a jarring, electric frequency that made my head throb. I sat at the metal table, my spine straight, refusing to let the gray walls crush me. Attorney Chikatilo entered a few minutes later, placing his leather briefcase on the table with a deliberate thud. He leaned in, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the sterile room. "You're in deep, Gemma," he whispered, his voice oily and low. "Elder abuse, pharmaceutical fraud, identity theft. Haddon is still willing to talk, though. Sign the confession, give us the SD card, and maybe he can convince the DA to go easy." I looked at him, my eyes sharp and focused despite the exhaustion. I wasn't the quiet sister who would crumble under pressure. "Justice is a slow-moving river," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But it eventually washes away every lie. You haven't defeated me, Chikatilo. You've just shown me where the deepest rot lies." I wasn't just speaking to him, I was reminding myself. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You're an auditor. You should know when the numbers don't add up. You're finished." He stood up to leave, confident in his victory. But as he turned, his briefcase caught the harsh light of the room. I noticed a small, rhythmic, blinking light near the latch. A specific blue flicker I recognized from my days auditing tech firms. It was a wireless sync signal, likely an automated cloud backup for his local files. In that moment, a cold, calculating clarity washed over me. By framing me and bringing me into the legal system, they had made a fatal tactical error. They had given me legal standing. In a U.S. court, a defendant has the right to discovery, the power to demand a full, unredacted audit of every financial record and communication held by the accusers. They thought they were burying me, but they had actually handed me the shovel. As the detective re-entered the room to begin the formal questioning, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a strategist who had finally seen the enemy's weakest flank. The fight was no longer in the shadows. It was in the light of the law, and I knew exactly which buttons to press. I sat in the silence of the holding cell later that night, the cold steel of the bench reminding me that while they had the law on their side for now, I had something much more dangerous, the password to their downfall. The fluorescent lights of the Secure Compartmented Information Facility, or SCIF, hummed with a sterile electric frequency that seemed to vibrate against my very skull. It had been 48 hours since my arrest, 48 hours of Haddon and Dahlia's faces plastered over every news cycle, and 48 hours since I had slept more than a handful of minutes. I was out on bail, a temporary freedom bought by a favor from a colleague who still believed in the numbers. I sat in a high-backed ergonomic chair, the cold glass of Attorney Chikatilo's private terminal beneath my fingertips. I felt like a ghost haunting my own execution. Across the sleek, minimalist desk, Haddon leaned back, his gold watch catching the overhead light. Dahlia sat beside him, her face a mask of practiced tragedy, scrolling through the social media comments that continued to crucify me. Chikatilo stood near the door, a shark in a three-piece suit, holding the settlement and waiver of claims agreement like a holy relic. I projected a broken spirit, keeping my eyes downward and my shoulders slumped. The greatest warriors are those who can walk into an enemy's camp and make them believe the sword in their hand is actually a white flag. "Gemma, this is the end of the road," Haddon said, his voice a low, oily purr. "Sign these, authorize the transfer of Lacey's hidden trusts to the company, and will instruct the DA to drop the elder abuse charges. You can go back to being the quiet little sister we all remember." I didn't look up, but I saw the predatory greed in the way Dahlia's pulse jumped at the base of her throat. I had spent my life auditing the greedy. I knew that for them, enough is never enough. I reached for the fountain pen, my hand trembling, a deliberate, calculated tremor. "I need to use the secure terminal," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and defeated. "The high-value transfer protocol for Mother's trusts requires a biometric and a manual override. I won't have my personal codes intercepted by a public network." Chikatilo smirked, gesturing to the terminal. He believed his system was impenetrable. He believed I was a beaten dog returning to its master. As I leaned into the terminal, the art of surrender was in full play. I began the process of signing away every legal right I had to the Bennett estate, effectively stripping myself of my name and my future. But as I tapped the screen, a hidden progress bar on my smartwatch, synced via a low-frequency Bluetooth bridge I had installed in the interrogation room's briefcase, began to glow. Every keystroke I made wasn't just signing a document. It was injecting a Trojan script into the heart of Chikatilo's mainframe. The thrill of the invisible heist was a cold fire in my veins. I felt the rot in the room, the overwhelming stench of their self-congratulation, yet I remained outwardly submissive. Chikatilo mocked my unfortunate fall from grace as I navigated the trust folders. He didn't see that with every second I stayed in that room, my software was extracting encrypted emails, offshore coordinates, and the deepfake audio signatures Dahlia had used to frame me. I used their own weapon as a biometric override key, bypassing their firewalls with the very voice they had stolen from me. I watched the data stream into my secure cloud. I saw the coordinates for accounts in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I saw the logs of their communications with the medical spa where Lassie was being held. Even as I dismantled their world, a flicker of pity touched my heart. I don't hate them for being thirsty for power. I pity them for not knowing that water from a poisoned well will never quench it. They were so focused on the prize that they never saw the hunter in the room. The final signature was complete. The terminal chimed, indicating a successful transfer. Haddon stood up, a triumphant grin finally breaking his composure. "You made the right choice, Gemma. For the first time in your life, you were useful." I didn't respond. I simply stood up, my gait slow and heavy, and walked toward the door. Chikatilo watched me go, his eyes full of contempt for the woman he thought he had just destroyed. The moment the elevator doors closed, the defeated slump vanished. My spine straightened, and my stride became a determined, rhythmic click against the marble floor. I didn't head for the parking lot. I headed for a secure Wi-Fi node 2 blocks away. True justice isn't a loud explosion. It's the quiet sound of a lock turning that the thief didn't know existed. I opened my laptop and began the tactical pivot. I didn't send the data to the local police. Instead, I uploaded the entire forensic package to the Treasury Department's FinCEN portal. I flagged the accounts for international money laundering and human trafficking. This triggered an automatic, unblockable international freeze on every asset Haddon thought he had just secured. By the time he tried to move a single cent of Lacey's trust, the digital iron curtain would be down. I sat on a park bench, the Houston skyline shimmering in the heat. My mind turned to the victims I had found in Haddon's emails, the contractors he'd bankrupted, the elderly investors he'd cheated. I ensured their pension funds were flagged for priority restitution in the upcoming federal seizure. I felt a sense of steady, quiet power. I wasn't just saving myself anymore. I was cleaning the house. A ping from my private investigator made me go cold. It was a grainy, long-lens photograph sent to my secure app. A black SUV was backed up to the rear entrance of a medical spa in Galveston. The driver was Haddon's personal assistant, the same man who had helped Lacey vanish a month ago. She was being moved. They were preparing to disappear her for good before the federal net closed. I watched the sunset on the horizon, the orange and purple hues reflecting off the glass towers. I knew that by this time tomorrow, my family's empire of lies would be nothing but a smoking pile of rubble, and my mother would finally be free. The dark times were over. The truth was coming. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address in Galveston. I didn't know what awaited me at that health center, but I knew I was finally stepping toward the truth. The rain had finally ceased, leaving Galveston smelling of salt and damp earth. I stood in the humid night, watching the black SUV pull away from the medical spa, unaware that the shadow following it was no longer a victim, but the architect of its destruction. I had seen my mother through a cracked window, alive, fragile, but breathing. That sight was the only fuel I needed. I didn't know what was waiting for me at the hotel ballroom, but I knew I was finally walking toward the truth. 1 hour later, the Houston luxury hotel stood like a glowing pillar of arrogance against the dark Texas sky. Inside, the victory gala was in full swing. I adjusted the lapel of my jacket, feeling the weight of the tablet in my hand and the original bank transfers tucked against my heart. I moved through the service corridors, slipping into the shadows of the tech booth overlooking the ballroom. Below, the scene was a celebration of vultures. Haddon stood at the center of the room, raising a glass of vintage champagne beneath a massive crystal chandelier that shattered the light into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Dahlia was beside him, draped in silk and surrounded by cameras, her face frozen in a mask of charitable grace. They were announcing the launch of the Lassie Bennett Foundation, a front designed to launder the very $15 million they had used to bury me. I watched them from the dark, a silent witness to their highest moment of pride. They built this stage on a foundation of sand, forgetting that the tide always comes back in. A man's character is like a fence. Once you pull out the posts of truth, the whole thing is just a pile of wood waiting for a spark. Haddon began his speech, his voice booming with a hollow, practiced sincerity about family values and honoring Mother's legacy. The elite of Houston applauded, blissfully unaware they were witnessing a heist. I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt a cold, surgical duty to the light. I chose this moment, the peak of their hubris, because the higher the climb, the more absolute the fall. I tapped the screen on my tablet. The celebratory slideshow of Lacey's life on the giant LED screens behind Haddon suddenly flickered. The room went quiet as the images of the past were replaced by a grainy, high-definition live feed. The guests gasped. It was a real-time broadcast of federal agents, led by my investigators, breaching the medical facility in Galveston. The camera caught the moment I entered the room and embraced Lacey, frail, silver-haired, but looking directly into the lens with eyes that were finally clear. The ballroom plunged into a deathly, suffocating silence. Haddon's glass remained frozen halfway to his lips. I stepped out from the shadows of the booth and walked onto the stage, my heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic finality. I didn't need a weapon. I didn't need to scream. I simply placed my tablet on the podium and triggered the FinCEN red flag protocol I had prepared. "The $15 million debt you tried to hang around my neck is void ab initio," I said, my voice carrying through the silent room without a tremor. It was born of fraud, deepfakes, and a betrayal of the blood that gave you life. I looked Haddon in the eye, seeing the first cracks of true terror in his expression. I explained to the stunned audience that the signatures Haddon relied on were his own confession. My backdoor access from the skiff had already redirected their $50 million Cayman stash into a victim restitution escrow account for everyone they had ever crushed. Dahlia began to scream, a shrill, ugly sound that tore through her socialite mask. "You're destroying this family, Gemma! You're a monster!" I looked at her with a profound, quiet pity. "I didn't destroy this family, Dahlia. I simply stopped pretending your lies were the walls holding it together." Federal agents in suits began to move through the crowd, their gold badges reflecting the chandelier light. Haddon and Chikatilo were handcuffed in front of the very cameras they had invited to document their triumph. The chaos of the ballroom began to fade as I walked away, leaving the flashbulbs and the shouts of the press behind. The transition was instant. I found myself on the quiet, screened-in porch of the family estate at dawn. The morning light was soft and golden, tasting of honeysuckle rather than old mahogany. I sat in a wicker chair, Lacey sitting beside me. We didn't talk about money, or the court dates, or the billions in seized assets. We just watched the birds return to the oaks. I handed her a cup of tea, real tea, made with my own hands, clear of any bitterness. "Everything is restored, Mom," I whispered. She took a sip, her hand steady, and gave me a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. I told her about the Lassie Center, the forensic firm I was building to protect other elderly parents from the vultures who share their last names. This wasn't just a victory of the law, it was a victory of the heart. The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. I didn't just escape their trap, I tore it open so no one else would ever have to fall into it again. I looked at the painting Autumn Twilight hanging on the porch wall and noticed the numbers Mother had hidden in the trees one last time. They weren't just a code for a bank account. They were a testament to a mother's belief that her youngest daughter was the only one smart enough and strong enough to fix what was broken. The sun finally set on the Bennett name, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I watched the stars begin to appear, realizing that the light I had been searching for wasn't in the ledgers or the bank vaults. It was right here, in the quiet integrity of a morning spent in peace. I was no longer the scapegoat, no longer the debtor, and no longer the girl they could ignore. I was exactly where I was meant to be. No lie is heavy enough to bury a hardened heart. Sometimes, the only way to find peace is to keep your distance from people with the same name but different souls. Have you ever experienced a similar story to mine? Share it with me in the comments. I'm listening.